Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar today, where we're querying whether what we're seeing is the end of globalization. The coronavirus pandemic has led many to predict the end of globalization, but now more than ever, international cooperation is necessary. So with us to discuss this proposition are two fantastic speakers. We have James Crabtree, Associate Fellow with the Asia Pacific Program and Associate Professor with the Lee Kuan Yew School for Public Policy, and Will Hudson, who's a political economist and principal of Hertford College in Oxford. Now, we have a large audience for today's webinar, so it may not be possible for me to directly go through all of your questions, but I will try and amalgamate and cover as much ground as possible. So without further ado, I'll hand over to James, who will kick us off this afternoon.
Thank you, Champa. So I'm joining you here this evening in Singapore, where it's 8 o'clock in the evening. The fact that we have a conversation between Singapore and London over Zoom calls, even in lockdown, suggests that globalization has still got some life in it. But I am going to argue, for the purposes of this panel, in a sense, the conventional view, I think now, which is that globalization as we have known it is in big trouble. And I just want to make 3 points to start. The basic points being that globalization as we knew it before the 2008 financial crisis was already stalled or in gentle decline at the time the coronavirus crisis began. The coronavirus crisis is going to accelerate a whole bunch of trends that will continue this. And then I want to sketch out what I think will happen next, trends towards regionalisation and other things. So let me just run through these. So when we talk about globalization, what I understand by this is the period of what's sometimes called hyper-globalization prior to the 2008 financial crisis. So deep integration between Western economies and the emerging world, and particularly the production of manufactured goods, what the trade economist Richard Baldwin calls the great unbundling, in which certain kinds of technology allowed you to shift production from factories in the West or in Japan to predominantly to Asia, but also to countries like Poland or Mexico. And this was a very radical shift in global economic production. It came along with the multinational corporations that, in a sense, almost all of global trade it passes through what trade economists call global value chains were created. So this is the globalization of Nike and Apple and Boeing. And although a lot of what we're going to talk about here is, in a sense, going to be critical of parts of that model, there's a lot to celebrate in what that model created, in particular in the emerging world. So around me in Asia, this was the model that made not just China, but a whole host of previously poor countries much richer than they were before and brought hundreds of millions into the global middle class. But that period of deep integration, in a sense, ran into the 2008 financial crisis. And after the 2008 financial crisis, it came out much changed. So we saw trade growth fall much more quickly than growth in the overall global economy. Foreign direct investment fell. You saw a retreat in some of these global value chains of production. They were shrinking a little bit. A whole host of the indicators that you would expect to be driving globalization ran into the financial crisis and then stopped. But there were other things going on as well. China's role in the world economy is changing. And in a sense, as China has become more important and has taken more of global trade, more intermediate goods and things like that, that has actually been a force to mean that there has been less trade between other countries. You've also seen technological changes where trade in goods is simply not as important as it was anymore. Companies are less necessary to go and find cheap labor in the emerging world, where much more economic value is to be found in high-end manufacturing or services, which don't necessarily need as many cheap bodies. So you had a whole range of reasons why the period of very rapid global integration was sort of plateauing or gently declining. And I think what we're seeing, the second point, is that the COVID crisis is going to accelerate a lot of these trends. So we've already seen the WTO last week predict a crunching decline in trade of a third, potentially over the next couple of years. I think it's almost inevitable that you are going to have, as you did have after 2008, a subsequent wave of protectionism, which is, as country, I mean, you've seen this already in medical equipment. I think we're quite likely to see it in food. And then the periods in which you have huge pressure on domestic governments to look after their own often come with other ranges of protectionism. And what's unusual about this crisis is how broad-ranging it was. We all thought 2008-9 was global and broad-ranging, but this is a crisis that is hitting almost every major productive economy in the world. And doing so with almost all industries at once. And so the demands for special protection from politically connected companies, whether it's steel makers in India or electronics manufacturers in Asia or sort of advanced manufacturers in the United States, are going to be very strong. Then you have a whole range of other factors that we will discuss. The companies themselves, I think, are going to have a look at their supply chains now and decide that they were too risky, given what's happened after the pandemic. And in particular, you have political pressure. So we have a whole range of problems in the relationship between the US and China, in particular, that are going to make the kind of global supply chains that we've seen develop over the last 20 or 30 years much more difficult. So what do we see instead? I don't think we're going to see a collapse in globalization. That's not really what we're talking about. So if you look at a company like Apple, there's been a lot of talk about reshoring or home shoring production, bringing goods made in China elsewhere, and Apple is the icon of globalization. And so far, it hasn't really done anything. It's moved very small proportions of its global workforce in contract manufacturing out of China and to anywhere else. And so although we've seen a lot of talk about shifting of production to either elsewhere in Asia or back home towards the US and Europe, there hasn't been very much of it so far. So we're still at a reasonably high base. And so that's why I think the debate about decoupling of the economies of the West and Asia is unlikely to happen. But that does mean that there's quite a lot of unpicking that can be done from a high base. And I think you are going to see that. You're going to see companies begin to move production from China into other bits of Asia, or from other bits of Asia back to countries like Mexico or Poland. You're certainly going to see countries in the West taking a good long look at what they consider to be strategic, and that's not just going to be ventilators and masks and the kind of things that we have found that we can't do without in this crisis. There are going to be a whole range of other goods which governments and companies are going to decide must be produced much closer to home with much less risk. You're going to see greater regionalization. You will see political sort of anti-Chinese feeling growing that will make it less easy for companies in the Western world to locate all of their production in China, or all or most of their production in China, and a whole range of other forces that I think will come to bear. So some of this may actually be reasonably positive. I mean, Will is going to, I think, make the contrary argument and one that I quite agree with, that we need global cooperation, not just to get out of this crisis, but to manage all sorts of other problems that we have in the world, not least climate change. And therefore, the idea that kind of a return to the status quo ante in 1980 is a positive one, I think, has little to recommend it. But we've known for a while that the globalization we had in 2005-06, the peak of hyper-globalization, was unstable, anti-democratic, and that we needed to rein in this model of globalization to some degree. We also need to make changes, particularly because of the climate. But I worry that the context in which this is going to happen is not one that is going to make it easy to have a kind of managed dial back of hyper-globalization into a more sustainable model of globalization, because you are going to have protectionism, a kind of geopolitical recession, as Ian Bremmer calls it, in which, as we've seen in abundance during the COVID crisis, there has been very little international cooperation, weak international institutions, not just the WHO, which we've been thinking about a lot this week, but the WTO, and all sorts of other of the policymaking institutions which managed the period of hyperglobalization. All of these are now coming under pressure. And so I worry that what we're heading for is a period of disorderly and fragmentation, disorderly and fragmentary globalization, as opposed to a kind of managed and orderly decline. And let me stop there and hand over to Will. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I mean, you've intimated that global cooperation is still needed, but the challenge is, are we going to see greater fragmentation? I mean, Will, one of the things we are seeing is that in some areas you are seeing international cooperation. If you look at vaccine development, for instance, you know, it's unprecedented to have so many scientists working across the world in order to find a vaccine. Do you have more optimism that there's still hope for globalization, or at least international approaches to some of these issues?
Well, of course, I mean, I recognize, you know, everything that James has said. I mean, and I think there's more than a risk. I mean, I think it's quite likely that the months ahead, the disorderliness, if you like, is going to trump orderliness, and I think that's clear. But my point is slightly different. I mean, I think that I take the view that I've been a critic of globalization for all the reasons that everyone will recognize on this webinar. I mean, the inequalities, the lack of democracy, the instabilities, and actually its kind of ungoverned and unmanaged nature. I mean, I've taken the kind of lifelong view as a Keynesian economist that there is that if you want the benefits of capitalism, you have to manage and govern it. There is a symbiotic relationship between capitalism and democracy. And actually, I think one of the intriguing things intellectually at the minute is that you've got these widely observed, and as James said in his opening remarks, is now the kind of new common sense. I mean, who isn't there kind of telling us that, you know, we're all going to hell in a handbasket, that, you know, Salvini is going to triumph and in Italy, and that the European Union is going to fall apart. You know, look at the rise of mercantilism in Asia, and you know, quasi-racist populism is on the march. And you only have to kind of mention Donald Trump, and everyone's kind of eyebrows kind of travel up their forehead. But I mean, so you know, that's all you take as a given. But I think there's something else interesting is happening here intellectually. That actually people like me and the kind of school of thinking that I've kind of represent are finding ourselves having a hearing that we wouldn't have expected even 5 years ago. I mean, so for example, if you make the point that actually a foundational kind of element of any kind of good capitalism is one, that the capitalist enterprise itself has to be propelled by some sense of societal purpose, and two, elements of the public infrastructure, not just roads, railways, and education, but public health, are actually foundational for any kind of successful, sustainable capitalism. You didn't get much of a hearing. I mean, the story was all about wealth generation, the burden of regulation, the burden of taxation, how liberalization was the order of the day. And again, I mean, you know, everyone knows the story. And I think that, you know, what has happened, you know, literally, I think in the last 6 weeks, is a recognition, extending it to large parts of center-right in Western democracies, that actually, you know, investments in public infrastructure and in particular public health are foundational. And actually, you know, if you want care homes that work, if you want enterprises to collaborate both within an economy and across borders, then they better have some sense of higher purpose and societal obligation than simply short-term profit maximization. And you know, that debate has bubbled to the surface, you know, much faster than I would have expected. So that, you know, all around Europe, you have, you know, investment institutions saying we expect the companies that we own to you know, think about their resilience, to cut their dividends, to conserve cash. That's what we expect of the companies that we own. And I think that one shouldn't kind of confuse the quest for resilience, which is going to obviously happen over the next you know, year or two or three. You know, you want resilient supply chains. You can't single source. If that source is going to be overwhelmed by a pandemic, you plainly have to have some national capacity to manufacture vaccines, manufacture masks, manufacture ventilators, to make your public health infrastructure kind of resilient. But one shouldn't confuse that quest for resilience necessarily with an outbreak of wholesale protectionism. And here I think that, some of the shocking figures that came out yesterday, I mean, the IMF's forecast for, synchronized decline, a kind of decline in world GDP of 3 or 4%, unprecedented, and actually some aspects of the world economy in kind of not just in depression but in near collapse. Of course, your first instinct, and we've seen this in the European Union, is kind of sauve-qui-peut. Every woman, every man, every nation state for him or herself. And we saw that the first instinct in the European Union. But actually, there's a second instinct, which is actually, hold on a minute. These institutions of collaboration have to be made to work. So, having had a very, very bad, I would say, first kind of few weeks of the crisis, the European Union, I know it has a mutualized debt and launched Corona bonds, but I think that the element of coordination that's taken place, the joint procurement policies in place, just information sharing about what the best kind of way to sequence an exit strategy, who's best to kind of in the quest to kind of get a vaccine kind of workable and manufactured in double quick time. What you're seeing is instincts for collaboration kind of trumping kind of instincts for nationalism. And I thought the Gordon Brown plan, which 10 days, 2 weeks ago, was an exemplar of thinking which you may think is redundant, but actually is having some purchase. My understanding is that both the Japanese and the French are really kind of lending their enthusiastic shoulders to this. It wouldn't surprise me if some of the signatories to that who are serving heads of state don't actually kind of jump to the defense of the World Health Organization, under assault as it is from Donald Trump, and under assault and obviously behaved imperfectly in the first weeks of the crisis. I mean, I think there's some criticisms can be fairly leveled at it, but nonetheless, you want an institution like this to be stronger rather than weaker. Any kind of viable future for all of us is going to have to, for example, international travel. There's going to have to be some kind of internationally accepted and policed form of ensuring that people get on aircraft have not got the disease, and who get off the aircraft have not got the disease. Otherwise, we're not going to have travel, and that's going to require some kind of international standard being set and observed. Otherwise, you're not going to get the benefits of international travel. And even the Chinese are discovering that actually, if you want to get your economy back on its feet, you have to allow visitors in from other countries. You have to, if you're going to have exports, you've got to have imports. There's got to be, some kind of two-way traffic here. And actually, if people don't trust that you are observing kind of international standards, you're in some trouble. So my point is not to argue that actually the international order is in a good place. It's probably not. My point is not to argue that globalization, as we organized it from 1980 through to today, with the extraordinary financial crisis of 2007-8, as a kind of landmark event showing its weaknesses, it's not to say that was an unimprovable model. Plainly not. I do think it did produce. I am of the view that wherever there has been kind of GDP growth and innovation, kind of historically, or actually in our times, is always associated with high volumes of trade. Trade is the necessary but insufficient condition for economic growth. And actually, one way or another, the world is going to find itself having to invent a framework in which trade relationships in services as well as manufacture going to go forward around rules of the game that are commonly shared, forms of adjudication, forms of policing, and then actually similar kind of things will have to happen on climate change, on the rule of the sea, the management of pandemics, the management of cyberspace, etc., etc., etc. The world simply has to find its way through to commonly held solutions here. And I would make a last remark, which is that actually it is intriguing that this particular seminar has attracted so many people to kind of listen to what James and I are trying to kind of figure out. And I'm struck, and rather like I'm struck in the debates over the European Union, which did find, there wasn't mutualization of the debt, which I know that the Italians and the Greeks and the French were pushing for, but it was a pretty reasonable package. And I don't think, and I think there has to be some kind of quid pro quo in human affairs. And actually, if there is to be debt mutualization in the European Union, we'll have to come with some kind of framework for how the money is raised, are kind of spent, and what the behaviors are of those who are jointly sharing this burden and this obligation. And to imagine there's a kind of, one of the things that I've always kind of bridled, speaking as a Keynesian economist, is the idea that Keynesian economics, or that there's economics of kind of the free lunch, that somehow there's no constraints, no mutual obligation, no disciplines kind of available. You can kind of invent a world in which those things don't exist. It's plainly, they have to be framed. So, any way of managing globalization is going to have to come up with functioning institutions that do just that. But here we are, you find, and I'm sure it's the same in other countries, we in Britain are watching like hawks, how the Italians and the Spanish, the Austrians and the Danes are managing their exit. We're watching like hawks what's been happening in Asia with their testing regimes. And why is it that their death rates per capita per 100,000 people are so much lower than France and Germany and Britain, kind of at the higher end of that range? What is it that other countries are doing that we could do better? So there's at this moment in time, you're beginning to see the invention, just as you are within the European Union, of the precondition, I think, for effective global governance, which is a sense of actually being kind of global citizens, of actually knowing a lot about each other's affairs, and understanding that we're not islands, that no country is an island, that actually there is massive interdependence in our times. And so, yes, all the negative and pernicious forces that James and I can jointly identify, and which have weakened the international kind of order over the last kind of 10 to 15 years, are there, and they're noxious, and they're growing, and they're difficult to, and they're destructive. But at the same time, there's a recognition that it doesn't lead anywhere. It's a dead end, all that stuff. I think that's a debate which is taking off in the States. Despite Trump's best efforts and the early kind of opinion poll kind of approval ratings he got, that's collapsed. And I don't think that Trump is a likely winner in the presidential election in November. And I think even the Chinese are kind of concerned about how they manage themselves. He's got to manage his public opinion too. What happened in Wuhan was not brilliant. And actually there's a kind of undergrowth of opinion transmission in China, which they try to police very aggressively, but it still exists. And Chinese citizens know full well the inadequacies of how this was initially kind of handled by the Chinese authorities. So don't run away with the notion that we're all doomed. I think that there are possibilities of collaboration, of reimagining a better world order than the one we have today. I think and I'm sure that's where we will finally land. The question is, and here I'll finish, is just what will be what the short-term cost will be, and whether the short-term will be months or years. And I readily recognize it could be years.
We're going to move on to our questions now. Just a reminder to our audience that if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function that you will see on the bottom of your screens. We've had a number come through already, so I'm going to go through the questions. For our panelists, if you could be as concise as possible, we can try and get through as many questions that we can. So one of the first questions that we've had is, the pandemic is affecting the global economy with unprecedented job losses and reduction of capacity due to sharply reduced economic activity. In your view, what industries do you think will weather this period of uncertainty better than others? Which do you think will struggle? And do you think multinationals will weather it better than businesses just based within home countries?
I'll have an initial crack at that, which is, so I think one of the curiosities about this this moment is that, in a sense, the reliance that we have on big tech companies will increase. And so one of the sectors that is going to do very well out of this is going to be technology, not just because of companies like Zoom that have suddenly gone onto everybody's radar, but if you look at the way the market has reacted, then it's pretty clear that the big tech companies are viewed as some of the most resilient, and that's partly because they will be beneficiaries of some of the big social changes that will follow this, partly because they're good companies anyway. In terms of which companies will lose, unfortunately, I think the premise behind your question is right, which is that it's small and medium-sized companies, smallholders, people in the gig economy, those who don't have access to capital, can't be bailed out, don't have political connections. They're the ones who are going to lose out most of all, and that's particularly so in the emerging world. I mean, at least in the developed world, you have governments that have relatively cheap access to debt, who can sort of open the floodgates. And despite the rather lamentable international cooperation, the response from many national governments on the fiscal side and the monetary side has been quite impressive, I think, compared to the 2008 crisis, less so in many cases on the medical side. So I think the people who will lose out are not going to be the multinationals, although they may rein in their sales a little bit. The people who will really lose out are going to be those who are small and don't get support.
I do think that some trends that were already observable are being accelerated, so that, for example, the shopping mall, the high street, which were in decline as in the decade up to 2020, I think it's going to be accelerated. I'm very struck when I have my leisure exercise hour and I go cycling around central London at the number of scaled up restaurant chains like Carlucci and Cote, Patisserie Valerie, that have gone bust. I do think that one sector of the economy which is in real trouble is private equity. The model was, leverage against collateralizable kind of bricks and mortar assets with strong cash flows, and they tended to be kind of in the hotel, restaurant, kind of drinks distribution sector, which has been the hardest hit. And I think those forms of kind of leveraged activity are, I think, going to be under very, very severe pressure. But otherwise, I think, what James described is broadly right.
Let me just ask James a question, and then we'll have a separate question for you. James, one of our participants has asked, do you think nations need to rethink their supply chain strategies and ensure at least they suggest 30% of critical goods are manufactured within the nation? If such production is not competitively priced, should governments subsidize, incentivize such manufacturing? And what do you think would be the repercussions of an approach like that, where you did have a certain percentage of goods manufactured within the nation?
Well, I think this is inevitable for at least a narrow range of goods, as I said in my opening statement. So we're going to start with the things that we really needed during this crisis, and then we'll fix that at least for a while. And then there'll be pressure to move much more broadly. So you can see this affecting in the UK, the debate about Huawei, for instance, that there's already some movement on, in a sense, what counts as reliance upon a Chinese telecoms provider. 30%, I have no idea. It sounds like a kind of arbitrary number, but I think there will be some move in that direction. I'm not sure that we should entirely welcome this. As Will said, what you need are supply chains that are resilient, that have some measure of redundancy. And so as long as your supply chains are diverse and you are accounting for genuine disasters like this one, then it doesn't seem to me that you need to suddenly repatriate all of everything, start making all of your own food all over again, because that would have real welfare implications. I mean, the reason why companies and governments were enthusiastic for globalization is that it's very efficient, and both Western consumers and lots of people in the emerging world did very well out of this system. So to row back on it entirely, I'm not sure would be very sensible.
And Will, you were arguing that growth has delivered massive benefits, but also you acknowledge that it has had costs. Do you think there's an opportunity for us in this moment to rethink the model of capitalism? Are there different ways to prosper that this gives us an opportunity to think about that perhaps was not available to us before?
Well, I saw that question and of course, I'm the author of The State We're In 25 years ago. I've been arguing for forms of stakeholder capitalism for most of my adult life, and I currently co-chair an organization called the Purposeful Company, which argues that companies should put purpose front and center of their activities, which should be a North Star guiding their strategies and giving them a kind of moral underpinning to what they do. That argument, which was pretty difficult to make, frankly, right up until just a few years ago, is more widely accepted. The American Business Roundtable saying what they said last August before the pandemic, and some of the reactions I thought in the States by the investment community to this has been extremely enlightened. And I do think the whole agenda about environmental, societal, governmental kind of considerations being taken into account in business strategies is going to be much more foregrounded. Yeah, the globalization was, as it was practiced in the run-up to this pandemic, there were some companies who really took no prisoners. Yes, on balance, everyone knows the figures were taken out of poverty in China, and everyone knows, the degree to which emerging economies and actually the Asian economy has actually benefited from globalization hugely. And actually there's been big benefits to, although costs, to Western societies in being able to get a wide range of goods much cheaper than they would otherwise have done, et cetera, et cetera. So, I kind of, the position I've tried to argue, again, as a Keynesian, is that, capitalism does do a pretty good job, actually. What it can't do is it by itself. The idea that the market system can be kind of left its own devices, and it's best if market actors simply respond to kind of price signals in markets and devil take every other consequence, which is the kind of hyper kind of libertarian liberalist approach we've had to this in the last decade. Was wrong then and is proven wrong now. And of course, I recognise the costs part of my career has been spent pointing them out. What I'm trying to say now is don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. The debate is, how to get companies to incorporate so that actually they do take societal obligations kind of at the heart of their operation. How do we get them to recognise that their stakeholder claims? To what extent do we get people to recognise that actually, paying minimal taxes, Arca, Amazon, and the high-tech giants that James was talking about, saying they're a beneficiary, how does one not just crack the fact they do it, but actually attack the culture behind it? I've always been struck in my exchanges with board members of these companies that they actually genuinely think that actually they can spend their money better than governments, that they have a moral obligation to avert tax and to kind of look for loopholes, that actually they are better at spending their money than governments. And when you get to a moment like this, it's probably obvious that's not the case. So I do think we're at and I think it behoves us, as the nationalists and the populists and everyone else kind of make their arguments about, let's put up the drawbridge and have a national community of our own producers, that we carry on making the benefits of trade, carry on kind of arguing the benefits of kind of the capitalist organization, but frame it better.
So my next question is actually for the two of you, and I'm pulling together a few of the questions that we've had. One thing that's been clear is the absence of global leadership. And some of our participants are asking, the UNSC hasn't been able to take collective action. The WHO is potentially facing, the World Health Organization is facing potential cuts. What is the role of the United Nations in dealing with this pandemic? Is there a risk that it will become further redundant? And outside of the United Nations architecture, where do you see the opportunities for global leadership? Because it's not coming from the traditional champions that we would have seen before.
I think, in a sense, the question is almost has the wrong premise, that the UN system is very unlikely to be where you get leadership in these kind of moments of global crisis. That's why the G20 was set up as the global forum that matters it wasn't set up in 2008, but it was kind of reconstituted around 2008, 2009, around the time of the London summit that Gordon Brown chaired. And so the G20 is your mechanism. There is no other mechanism, really. I mean, in the absence of the G20, if you think the G20 is bust and isn't going to work, then you've got to imagine some much more unlikely set of circumstances, either something that is led by some constellation via China, or that is led by, in a sense, a coalition of the willing, the Abes and Macrons and a few other kind of technocratic leaders. But the G20 was set up exactly for this kind of crisis, and that's the problem. The problem is it isn't working. And so I completely agree with what Will said, that in a sense what COVID-19 is going to reveal is that we need global cooperation. Now, the fact that we need it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to get it. And unfortunately, that seems to be the lesson of the last few weeks, because as Will said, it's clear that there's no route out of this for one country alone. There's no end to this crisis if you yourself are as good as Singapore or Taiwan or Germany or New Zealand. That's not good enough. You can't reopen your economy until almost everybody else has managed to get rid of it as well. You can't have flows of people, you can't have trade. All of the things that the global economy needs require international cooperation. And I suppose my worry is that the fact that it seems blindingly obvious that this is necessary, so far at least, hasn't been enough for it to happen. And I fear that that may be the pattern that we're going to get used to, not just on the COVID side, where there's a whole bunch of things in terms of the search for a cure, managed sort of rescues in the event of, I think, an inevitable financial crisis somewhere or other, all sorts of things, but also in other areas. As Will said, there are a whole host of pressing areas, from the regulation of artificial intelligence to climate, that require global cooperation. And if the US and China and everyone else are fighting with one another, or at least sulking with one another, then these forums don't work very well. And that seems to be the future that we're looking at. So in a sense, and unfortunately, the performance of the G20 over the last month, I think, is a rather pessimistic sign of the world that we're moving into.
Will?
Look, I mean, I think, again, I mean, this is, I'm not saying anything that everybody observing us discuss will know this, but the United States, the dollar remains the international currency that's preeminent. It may be the US economy is only whatever it is, a fifth or a quarter of world GDP compared to the kind of 50% it was in 1950. Nonetheless, as I always try to observe, the majority of the world's top 500 corporations are either US owned or have substantive operations in the United States. I mean, unless the United States is prepared to kind of accept a leadership role, and there's and some acceptance by those who are led that there's some burden sharing to be done, then you're not going to get off the ground, really. And here the brutal truth is, again, is Donald Trump and the kind of America first, which has always been, it's always been there, the United States and America first. I mean, that's how we had Smoot-Hawley back in the day, the tariffs that precipitated the Great Depression. But I, observing the American debate, and I don't think that he's going to get re-elected. And I think, that a precondition for better leadership is to have either a liberal or a Republican or a decent Democrat in the White House, backed by being able to muster reasonable majorities in Congress. And if you don't have that, you're in substantive trouble, particularly if your interlocutor, the number two economy in the world, is China. And And, you know, Chinese priorities are entirely about the preservation of a one-party state. But that itself is under tremendous pressure. I mean, I regret very much that when Deng Xiaoping took over in 1979, you know, he foretold that by 2020, China would be moving to some form of Chinese democracy with Chinese characteristics. But we're a very far cry from that. But opinion in China is not as monolithic as it's often portrayed in the West. You know, there's huge strains, you know, within the Politburo and within the Communist Party. And it's not impossible that under the incredible pressures this pandemic is throwing up, and actually the threat it's posing to the attempt by the Chinese to kind of extend their soft power, that you might find change in China matching change in the United States. And then you start to have kind of groupings like the G20 start to work. But for that to happen, and here I'm going to be accused of being idealistic by people who are listening to this. I do think ideas matter. And I think that one of the failures is not only of leadership, but of being able to provide really good intellectual framework and ideas that kind of effective leaders can draw on. And one of the baleful consequences, in my view, of the rise of the kind of hyper-libertarian right in the United States has kind of disabled the West in having the kind of intellectual framework that allows them to get the appropriate mix between public and private, capitalism and democracy in our times. The Koch brothers and all the people who funded the extreme rights in the United States we're playing out the consequences of the rise of that. But again, the pandemic is producing countervailing intellectual forces, the kind of debate that James and I are having, for example, which is being mirrored in many other countries. So, you can't have leadership without people being prepared to be led, and you can't have leadership without ideas that actually frame effective leadership. And, I'm hopeful that the latter two things can come into play in the years ahead.
Thank you, Will. James, I have a question for you now as we enter the sort of final stages. One of the fault lines that we have seen is around immigration. And one of our participants is asking, do you think that there's an opportunity here for countries to revise their policies and open themselves up to immigration in the future in order to rebuild their economies? Or do you think that we're going to see further isolationist approaches despite the fact that it might impact the economy?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, there has been some thinking about this, that what you may not see out of the end of this is as bad a kind of jobless recession as you might fear, because the nature of the COVID crisis, the recovery is going to be quite labor intensive. You're going to need a lot of people doing everything from, more people working in hospitals, more people working in restaurants, more people managing social distancing. There'll be a lot of kind of manual work. And so it is possible, I think, for instance, you take a country like the UK, that we come out of this in a much less anti-immigrant frame of mind than we did in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum, particularly given the huge upsurge of goodwill towards the foreign workers who've been saving people's lives in the NHS. However, I think you then have to balance that against the fact that we are going to be moving into a world in which people movement in general is going to be much lower than we've been used to. There's going to be a lot of regulations about simply traveling from place to place, let alone moving from place to place. There was a good article in the FT today questioning whether we have or are about to reach peak expat, people like me who choose to live halfway around the world, partly because it's interesting and you learn a lot, or for whatever reason. That's going to be more difficult, at least in the aftermath of this. I know this, I work in a university here in Singapore, and so moving students in and out and around the world as we've got used to is going to be very difficult for the next couple of years, and maybe longer. And some of these things are going to have a considerable lag effect. So I think while there is a case to be made that the recovery from this recession may be more labor intensive than you would expect. And maybe the vision that everyone's going to invest in robots and desperately try and reduce their reliance on humans, that might be slightly overdone. You've got to counterbalance that with the fact that this is going to be a much less mobile world, at least for a good period of time. And so I suspect net, actually your question is wrong, and that will not mean that there's going to be a huge upsurge in international immigration after this, probably the opposite.
Will?
Yes, no, I've just been amused seeing that James has managed actually to tweet during the course of this debate. This man is truly kind of a man who can, multi-purpose debater. Look, I mean, the university which I'm part, obviously we're concerned about the decline in international students. But what becomes very evident is that the appetite to travel and learn internationally is kind of more intense, and where we have pent-up demand to move, and that's why I said what I said earlier, and I do think that developing some certification process by which we are all able to assure the host country in which we are either traveling as tourists or as doing business or aiming to settle, that we are not ill, is going to become, absolutely fundamental. Well, and, the Americans and the Chinese alike will finally have a kind of a twin interest in actually having a strong rather than weaker World Health Organization or variant who can provide such a benefit. Will we actually? And then there's this whole question, and of course, when you talk about immigration, and we need to call a spade a spade. I mean, host countries are, and it's not only European countries like Britain and Germany and France who are suspicious of non-white immigrants. There are difficulties, well known in Asia between, I mean, James is in Singapore. I mean, Malaysia is hardly friendly to some form of Asian immigrants. I mean, and actually, one of the things that I think is happening, I was very impressed by some of the widely circulated news reports about people's experience in, Wuhan, and comparing it with, Bergamo in Italy, or distressed hospitals in Spain and Britain. I mean, actually, the human experience of lockdown, is the same, there's a humanity in this pandemic. I mean, the distress of a Spanish or a Chinese woman at losing her husband, her father, or whoever, or vice versa, is obvious to us all. So, I mean, in the debate about autarky or non-autarky, that is this pandemic going to make us more autarkic? Or I expect to find us, pining and wanting the openness that we've so enjoyed over the last 10 years. And actually, when it talks about reconstructing our economies, we're certainly going to want to construct our post-COVID economies so that they're more resilient. And we're certainly going to want to kind of construct them around organizations, as I said earlier, that have some sense of societal purpose at their heart. But I don't think they're going to be necessarily kind of the closure is going to be the order of the day. I'm hoping that, again, I can't tell you whether this turbulent period is going to last, 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years. But I'm very confident in saying that it must and will end, and that there will be a new era that follows it of managed openness.
Thank you. James, I have a question for you now, because in this new era that we're hoping will transpire, one of our questions is, for a long time there's been work done within the zoonotics field between the interface between environmental factors, animal management, food management systems, and disease management. Do you think there will now be an incentive for conservation specialists to work with financial experts, to work with health experts, to actually come together to think through how we might manage future pandemics? Or do you think the current system is too fragmented, too atomized in order for that to actually happen?
No, I mean, I think that's really the absolute minimum that you can expect to happen. So I would genuinely be surprised if the world collectively did not come up with better systems to manage pandemics. I mean, I think one of the things that the reason why sitting here in Singapore and East Asia, the advanced industrial economies of East Asia have done so much better than the economies of Europe, with the exception of Germany and North America, is that they had, recent lived experiences of something close to a kind of mini version of this pandemic, and they developed systems, both warning systems, healthcare systems, economic systems that responded much more effectively in the early stages. And so I would be genuinely surprised if we didn't all get our act together and realize that we haven't spent very much money on pandemic preparedness, and we really, really, really don't want anything like this to happen again. What I think the broader question then is, do we become, as governments or the international system, do we become better at anticipating catastrophic tail risks events in general? So climate change is one, but I mean, I recently reviewed for the FT a book by a colleague of Will's at Oxford, Toby Ord, looking at different apocalyptic scenarios, ranging from not just natural pandemics, but biowarfare, accidental nuclear weapons, climate, all the way through to general artificial intelligence, the robots taking over and deciding that we all need to be killed. That I'm much less kind of hopeful about, because it requires the kind of in-depth international cooperation and finance that currently we're finding very difficult to deliver through international institutions. That's partly because of the US and China, but it's not only because of that. It's just in general, there's an entropy within the international system, which is making it more difficult to police and update old rules, and more difficult to set up institutions to manage new ones. And so while I think we will come out of this with much better systems for managing pandemics, whether or not that would stop the next one, I don't know, but certainly gives a better chance. But I'm much less optimistic, for instance, that take climate as an example, that coming out of this with the degradation in international cooperation that's going to come out of COVID, that we're going to be better able to reach international agreements on climate change. I think rather alarmingly, it's more likely to be the other way around.
Thank you. And Will, just on that, because sometimes the international order is used as a synonym for the liberal international order, and certainly all parts of the order aren't liberal. But one of our questions is, do you think the liberal order will survive the coronavirus pandemic? It's already under strain, not least within liberal democratic countries, where there's certainly a dissonance between values expressed and actions taken. But what changes, if any, do you think might occur?
Gosh, these are questions which, what a huge question. I mean, and it's a very good question. I think the liberal order set up between 1945 and 1955 broadly, I mean, is obviously quaking. Will it pull through? I think one of the key judgments you have to make in answering that question is whether you think the European Union will pull through, because that is a foundational kind of liberal kind of project. I mean, that is, and if it can't hold, then the whole thing can't hold. And by the way, one of the kind of pillars of many of the initiatives on climate change or on free trade or upholding the WTO and all the rest of it lies in the European Union. I think it will hold, but only a fool would deny the strains it's under. And one of the reasons why I think it will hold is that I think that the elites and populations, in the European Union, basically get it. I mean, they buy the essential European Enlightenment propositions, and they stand by them. If the European Union manages plainly manages this pandemic as well as parts of Asia, better than America, and better than kind of the less developed world, and actually gets and manages its exit effectively, I think you have your answer. I think the liberal order will hold. So one of the reasons I'm so opposed to Brexit is because I think it has weakened the European Union and weakened Britain, and made that project that much harder. But that's the way I see it.
James, did you want to give us your final thoughts on that question?
It's a very big and complicated question. I think viewed from Asia, it seems to me inevitable that over the coming, decades, that what we have come to understand to be the sort of natural order of the international system in which Western countries play a preponderantly influential role is not going to hold. I mean, it can't. It sort of simply can't reflect the changing nature of the world economy. And so just as you have seen, institutional innovation, the Chinese setting up their own investment bank, potentially the Chinese, or maybe even the Americans will set up a rival to the World Health Organization. You see already over the last 10 years that there's been a lot of change in the way that the international order is set up, the institutions that underpin it, the norms and codes that drive it, and the countries that, in a sense, are the drivers of those institutions. I think that will continue. That doesn't necessarily mean that the liberal order institutions like the World Bank and the IMF and the United Nations are going to collapse. They'll still be there, but they will play a less powerful role within a more fragmented and, in a sense, more Asian international system.
Thank you, James. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. I do want to thank our speakers for answering as many questions as you did. And to our participants, my apologies, I wasn't able to get through all the questions, but hopefully we were able to address as many as possible. So thank you to everyone for joining us today. Please do keep a lookout. We're doing regular webinars at the moment. And if you could join me in virtually thanking our speakers today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Champa.